Hey guys, Jake Carlson here, host of the Modern Leadership Podcast. Are you ready to focus on amplifying your leadership superpowers? Let's go! Good morning, my friends and fellow elite achievers. Welcome to Modern Leadership, the podcast where each week we sit down with authors, entrepreneurs, and leaders to explore their journey, diving into the ups, their downs, and ultimately the lessons they learned along the way. Our goal? To show that everything is figure-outable. And today's guest is Corey Phelps. Corey is a professor of strategy and associate dean of executive education at McGill University. For over 20 years, he's conducted award-winning research on corporate growth and traveled the world as a keynote speaker, corporate trainer, and consultant, helping organizations become more innovative and strategically agile. He is the co-author of Cracked It, How to Solve Big Problems and Sell Solutions Like Top Strategy Consultants. And today, he is our modern leadership guest expert. Corey, how are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you.
Well, boy, that was a mouthful, but that was all business. Tell us a little bit about you personally.
Sure. So I live in Montreal right now where it's snowing voraciously outside. And I know you're in sunny Arizona, so I'm a little jealous. As you said, I'm a professor at McGill. I'm also an associate dean of executive education. I've had the opportunity to live in a lot of great places. So before we lived here in Montreal, I was a professor in Paris, France at HEC Paris. Before that, I lived in the great city of Seattle, Washington, which is someplace I still miss because of the great outdoors there. Spent a bit of time in New York City where I did my PhD at New York University. We overlapped in terms of you and I, as we were just talking about, lived in San Diego at different times, but loved San Diego and grew up in the great state of Montana in the United States. So I've had the chance to live in 3 different countries and great cities.
And one of the things we love to talk about on this podcast, I've done a lot of traveling myself, and I find leadership everywhere, from different types of leadership you probably saw in Montana, different ways of leading in Paris and San Diego, all over the world. There's different types of leadership, and you have the unique opportunity to kind of write about it and to talk about it, to speak about leadership and corporate growth all over the world. So tell me, how did you get into this line of work?
Okay, so an academic is something that you usually do when you're young. I wasn't too young. I was 30 years old when I started. I had this idea that at that age, after doing an MBA, I was going to work a while and then go back and do a PhD. And a couple of my professors that I had become friends with said, that'll never happen because you'll have a wife, you'll have a family, you won't want to go back and be a starving doctoral student. So I think the basic thing that motivated me to become an academic and study management and leadership was 2 things, really. One, I'm intellectually curious, and being an academic means that you get to research any topic you're interested in for as long as you want to research that topic, as long as you can publish your research in academic journals. So I love to do research. I love to explore and learn new things. And the second thing is I love to be in front of the room helping people learn. So that's the other side of being an academic, is to be a teacher. So those 2 things fit my personality really well. I had the opportunity to pursue that, like I said, when I was younger, and I did it. And I got to say, it's probably the best decision I've ever made in my life, with the exception of family. So I'm extremely happy with what I get to do because as you said, I get to study and learn every single day about management, about leadership, about organizations.
Well, we got to dive into this because we've got to take some of that research and knowledge that you have and get it out for the listeners of this podcast. And one of the things I'd love to jump in and focus on is this idea that the World Economic Forum predicts that more than 1/3 of all jobs across all industries are going to require complex problem-solving skills by 2020. I mean, we're looking at next year is going to require this complex problem-solving. Yet, in spite of this, Bloomberg, Financial Times, a lot of these research companies are saying, look, problem solving is a critical MBA skills gap. You're an MBA, I'm an MBA. We've got all these new college graduates that are missing this essential thing that's basically now. We need it now. Tell us about this.
No, I think it's a great observation. It was one of the reasons why we wrote the book, in fact. So I spend a lot of my time with MBA students, as you just mentioned. And one of the things that I really try to instill in them is that no matter what their job is after they get out, if they're managing people, if they're not managing people, whatever function they work in, whatever industry, is that they're going to spend a lot of time on solving complex problems. Someone's going to come to them with a fire. That fire they're going to have to put out. It's going to involve knowing a little bit about a lot of different things. So it might be a little bit about human motivation, how to motivate and inspire people, might require a little bit of finance, a little bit of marketing. So they're going to have to figure out a way to systematically bring that knowledge to bear, to identify what the problem is and to develop a solution, and then go about convincing other people to implement that solution. So I spent a lot of time doing that. And as you just said, whether it's the World Economic Forum, FT, or Bloomberg, what recruiters and what experts are telling us is that whether it's business schools, undergraduates, even if you drill down deeper into tertiary, secondary education, they're not doing a sufficient enough job to give people the skills that they're going to need to succeed in work. And that's really what the Future Jobs Report by the World Economic Forum said.
Well, let me ask you why you think this is. And I'm going to offer my kind of thought, and you tell me if I'm off base on this.
Sure.
MBAs and a lot of these academic programs, they like to show things that are quantifiable, that they are objective as rather than subjective. And I think that there's a fear of kind of tackling this strategic problem-solving gap that we're talking about because it's harder to quantify and objectify in our process of teaching people. Now, tell me about why we have this gap.
Well, I think that's part of the issue, but I also think it's about how business schools in particular are designed. We are designed in a way. So let me go back a second. I'm largely trained as an economist, so I sort of see the world through demand and supply. Teachers, we're supplying to a certain extent learning. And the way we're organized is we're organized by function. So you got a finance department, you got a human resources department, a marketing department, a strategy department, an accounting department. And to my point earlier, to solve problems, you need to be able to integrate knowledge from all those areas. The challenge is inside a business school, how do you get faculty from these different departments to want to work together? Because that's the only way that you're going to be effective at teaching problem solving is if you get faculty from different departments to coordinate and deliver courses or other experiential learning opportunities together. And there's a reason that we're called cats, trying to herd a bunch of academic cats, get them to cooperate and coordinate to deliver things like a problem-solving course for students is a very challenging thing to do. We like to be left to our sort of own little silos. So I think that contributes to the challenge as well. Yes, I agree that part of it is this push for quantitativeness, this push to try to convert everything to a number, which all problems can't be reduced to. I also think it's the way that the modern business school is designed as well.
Okay, well, I think we can go deeper into this by looking a little bit about what you wrote about and these 5 pernicious pitfalls of problem solving. So let's dive into that and see if this will help us kind of explore this a little bit more.
Sure. So as we talk about in the book, there's 5. I can walk through each one of these, but why don't we start with where I think problem solving begins? And that's with something tells me that I've got a problem in the organization. Now, a very simple example would be something that happened to me last week. I'm sitting in a meeting with colleagues of mine here at McGill, and up on the screen is a graph. And the graph has an arrow that's trending downwards. So we'd rather that graph be trending upwards. In fact, that was enrollment of a particular program. Mm-hmm. So very quickly, the group of us realized that that's not what we want. We want enrollment to be going up, not to be going down. So that tells us there's a problem. Now, what often happens in that sort of situation is everybody wants to jump in and talk about their ideas for how to fix the problem. In other words, jump in and talk about what the solution is.
Like a brainstorming session.
Absolutely. People love to brainstorm because we love to come up with ideas for solutions. We'd like our solution to be the one that's chosen to be implemented.
And we actually feel like we're really making progress because it's activity versus accomplishment. We feel like we're doing something. And even though we don't ever end up at accomplishment, we feel good because we're actually involved. We're active.
That's right. And that, to me, represents the first pitfall of problem solving because nobody has stopped and said, wait a minute, do we even understand the problem that we're trying to solve? Do we understand what's causing it? Do we understand what success looks like? Do we understand who the stakeholder groups are? Is this even our problem to solve? In other words, do we own this? So it's often the case that we, because of this temptation and desire to take action, we want to brainstorm, we want to come up with ideas, that we just skip over the very first and probably most important step of problem solving, which is to define what the problem is first. So again, we view that as a classic pitfall because oftentimes people don't want to do that. It's not sexy, it's not fun, but it's extremely important to coming up with viable solutions.
All right, then we go to what's next.
So one of the other pitfalls that we talk about in the book is what we call the solution confirmation bias. And some of your listeners might be familiar with just the confirmation bias in general. This is the idea that as human beings, we tend to pay attention to things, information that support our beliefs, support our views. And anything that is inconsistent with our views, we tend to either ignore it or we tend to discredit it.
And this is the idea where when you have a hammer, every problem looks like a nail.
Well, actually, that's a slightly separate one. That we call that the wrong framework problem, or what is known as Maslow's hammer. And that's the idea, as you just said. If I've got one tool in my toolkit, so if I've got a hammer, for example, then that toolkit informs how I see the world. So everything becomes a nail because the only tool in my arsenal is a hammer. So it's related to the confirmation bias because it basically says, what am I good at? What do I believe I'm good at? And then I'm going to basically make sense of my world, make sense of problems that are around me through that very narrow lens.
Okay.
I can give you a great example of the solution confirmation bias in practice. It's an example from the book, and it comes from the world of retailing in the United States. So this is a story that we tell in the book by a gentleman by the name of Ron Johnson. So some of your listeners may be familiar with him. He was the guy that literally helped Steve Jobs create the Apple stores.
Okay.
So one of the most successful retail formats in the world. Now, Johnson was brought to Apple because he actually helped create Target. We know what Target is today in the US. It's a highly successful mass merchandiser that has really tried to move up market in terms of their brand with, again, reasonable price merchandise. Well, after his success at Apple, JCPenney, the very old department store chain in the United States, recruited Ron Johnson away to try to resurrect JCPenney. So JCPenney had fallen on hard times, stock price had declined, revenues were flat, profit had declined, they were hemorrhaging customers. So Ron Johnson was brought in as the savior. The stock market reacted very favorably. The day it was announced that Johnson was to become CEO of JCPenney, the stock of JCPenney went up by about 18 percentage points. So clearly, equity investors thought, hey, this is great. We love this. This guy's got the Midas touch. Within a few months after starting as CEO, Johnson announces to the world, I have the solution to JCPenney's performance problem. And it consisted of a few pillars. Pillar number one was everyday low pricing. So JCPenney was known as discounters. So Johnson said, we're going to get rid of all discounts. No more sales promotions. We're going to move to an everyday low pricing strategy. Component number two was we are going to completely reorganize our merchandise. We're no longer going to organize based upon function. So no longer is there going to be a men's suit section. There's no longer going to be a houseware section. It's going to be 100 boutiques in a JCPenney store. You walk in and you see a Levi's boutique that sells all Levi's merchandise. You see a Martha Stewart boutique that sells all Martha Stewart merchandise. So the idea there'd be 100 of these in the store. And then he said, we have to drop the JCPenney brand name. It's old, it's outdated. So we're going to now start calling the company JCP. So he rolled out a rebranding initiative to capture this change to an everyday low pricing strategy, to a 100 boutiques in a store strategy. And he created this new brand, JCP, to reflect this. The last thing he did was he got the sales clerks out from behind the cash registers. He equipped them with tablet computers that would allow them to take people's credit cards and debit cards on the floor and check them out while they were shopping. Mm-hmm. So he rolled this out a few months after he started, and about 9 months later, the results came in, and the results were a disaster. Same-store sales had fallen at JCPenney stores by 25%. The stock price had collapsed. It fell by almost half. They had taken on over $1 billion in additional debt to roll out these changes across the entire organization. It was a solution that was massively rejected by JCPenney customers because it turns out that the classic JCPenney customer, like my mom, where I grew up in Billings, Montana, and shopped at a JCPenney store, she loved discounts. She loved the thrill of the hunt. She was confused by this new organization of the merchandise. She was comfortable with shopping in children's wear, women's dresses, and so on. And what completely freaked her out was when she went into a JCPenney after they had made the changes, and she was shopping for a dress, and a young woman came up to her with a tablet computer and said, "Ma'am, may I take your credit card?" My mom was like, "I don't want to give my credit card to you. I have no idea who you are." So this solution was completely rejected by JCPenney customers. It had disastrous consequences for JCPenney. And if you dig a little bit deeper into the story behind this, what this largely was a story about Johnson being fixated on what worked for him at Target, what worked for him at Apple, and saying, "I think this is going to work for me at JCPenney." And the naysayers, and there were many inside JCPenney saying, "I don't think this is going to work on our customers. You can't take the Target and Apple model and think it's going to work here." He basically said, "You're not a team player. If you want to innovate, get on board. If you're not on board, then leave the organization." So for me, it's a combination of a few different pitfalls. He had a solution in mind very early. He ignored and rejected information that suggested that maybe he should rethink this. He reasoned by analogy, which is another pitfall that we talk about in the book. He said what worked at Target, what worked at Apple is surely going to work at JCPenney. Mm-hmm. And he largely had a single tool, sort of a single go-to solution in his toolkit that he just assumed would work at JCPenney. The part of the story that we learned when we were writing the book that really bowled me over when I learned about it was, according to multiple press articles that we read, Johnson was asked by a member of the board of directors, "Don't you think you should test this idea out on maybe one store, maybe two stores, do a pilot project?"
Sure.
To which Johnson allegedly responded, "We didn't test at Apple. So if we didn't test at Apple, I don't need to test this at JCPenney."
And I see another kind of problem-solving problem that came up in this one, at least the way you tell the story, and that is arrogance or ego bias. Yes. I mean, this is a guy who felt like he had all the solutions and the ideas, and nobody else could, by either fear or intimidation, or just out of him ignoring them, weren't able to share their opinions or offer options.
Absolutely. And I think this is one of the challenges that we have when we think about problem solving. We often think that the more experienced we are, the longer we've been in a particular business or a particular industry like Johnson was in retail, the better we get at problem solving. And in fact, what we often see is that expertise, that experience can come back to haunt you. It constrains your ability to think of innovative solutions. And to your point, it often constrains your willingness to get diverse opinions and seek feedback from others before you decide what solution to implement. So call that arrogance, call that hubris, call that overconfidence. I think it's all of those things.
You know, it's very interesting. I do a lot of coaching, and what I've noticed that happens is after you work with a coach for a little while, you need to shake it up. Otherwise, you and your coach will often see or not see the same blind spots. I mean, as you get working with somebody and get close and understand each other's thinking and processes, all of a sudden you start falling into this same blind spot, not noticing the blind spots, and then all of a sudden these problems can build up and you not even notice them, just like our friend Johnson here.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And this is why, I mean, the fact that somebody hires a coach like you is a good sign because it suggests that they don't believe they have all the answers. They don't believe that they have the best way. And when we're talking about the type of complex problems that Johnson faced with JCPenney, you have to be willing and able to leverage the diversity of expertise, the diversity of experience that people have, and figure out a way to leverage it and bring it to bear rather than say, I've seen this before, so what worked for me in the past is surely going to work for me in this situation at JCPenney.
Yeah, and really being open to those that you work with and around and really look for it. Now, there's something that's burning on my mind that we've talked about a couple episodes back, and that is this idea that today in leadership, we're losing our ability, losing our opportunity to be still, to think through complex problems. And this is because we take our laptops with us everywhere. We have podcasts going when we're in the car. I mean, literally the only time that it's sometimes silent for us to think is in the shower. And people say, oh, I have my best ideas in the shower. Well, that's because it's the only time that you're still. So let me ask you about leadership and stillness and this problem-solving dilemma that we have.
I think it's a great insight. I myself have become quite recently a big fan of mindfulness. This sort of similar to stillness in terms of being able to stop, center yourself, and then give yourself an opportunity to reflect on what's going on. And I think that's a powerful way to approach problem solving because of this, whether it's the tremendous amount of information that's coming at us through all of the devices we use, or the time pressures that we face in the organization to get things done, and the pressures that we're facing from, for example, shareholders if we're a publicly traded firm. All of those pressures often cause us to jump right into the thing that we want to do, which is talk about the solution, when what we really need is the stillness, the calmness, the ability to reflect and start with, do I even understand what it is I'm trying to solve here? So I think that's a complementary skill set to problem solving, which is the ability to be mindful and still mentally to help you be much more disciplined and methodical in terms of how you approach complex problems.
And I think it's important as leaders that we allow our followers to take some time to think through complex problems, to not just act always, but give them the space, understand that they're going to need a little bit of space to think through these problems and not just always be putting out fires. One of the problems with leadership today, I think, is that we spend most of our time reacting to problems, fighting fires and reacting to problems, and not enough time being proactive and coming up with solutions before the problems either happen or before they get too deep.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I mean, I think there is this sort of tension that exists in all organizations and all leaders, which is, okay, I've got to react to the fires that are happening to me, but I also have to think about what's in the best long-term interest of my team and my organization. In other words, I have to be thinking about the future. I have to be proactive. And again, I think that pendulum often swings to encourage us to be reactive and consumed by the latest challenge, the latest fire, the latest escalation that's been put in front of us, rather than to be, again, more still, more thoughtful, more focused on being proactive.
And I know in the book you talk about ways that we can overcome the solution confirmation bias and the wrong framework problem and some of these things that we talked about. Obviously, start with number one, defining the problem, understanding what you're really facing. But what are some of the other things that we can do to defeat the pitfalls of problem solving?
Well, it starts with saying, I'm going to follow a disciplined method, because a method basically imposes discipline. It says, okay, in our method, there's 4 steps. So right there's 4 steps. Let me follow those 4 steps. And the fact that you have the discipline to walk through those 4 steps minimizes the fact that you're going to probably skip over one of them. So again, for us, it starts with define the problem. We use the term state. So state what the problem is. And we have a tool. We have a framework for how to state a problem. And that forces you to be able to say, before I even think about coming up with ideas for solutions, let me understand what's going on. The second part of the framework is to structure a problem. So what I mean by structure a problem is, let's try to figure out what all the potential causes are of this problem. And a way to do that is what is known as an issue tree. An issue tree just asks you to try to sketch out on a piece of paper, what are all the possible causes that could be driving this problem? And then you use that to help you solve the problem, because then once you have the potential causes, you can go collect information. You can go talk to people. You can collect quantitative data to find out which of that list of potential causes is actually operating in your problem. And once you know it, then you can say, now I've identified the cause. I have a better idea what the solution is. And then I'm going to have to persuade other people to buy into what my solution is. I'm going to have to develop a compelling and persuasive sales pitch for my solution. So for us, the power of a method is the discipline that it imposes upon people. And it's the tools that come along with it. It's the tools that help you understand, how do you state a problem? How do you structure it? How do you solve it? And then how do you sell it?
And I'm going to prove to you how big of a nerd I am, but the whole time that you're talking, I am picturing Tony Stark in his little Malibu office, with the big computer where everything's 3D and he's kind of pulling it apart and pulling pieces off and nope, don't need that. Nope, don't. This is where we need to focus. And so I love this idea of giving our teams the opportunity to assist in the problem solving, to surround ourselves with good people, and to really tackle these problems head on. Of course, we could go on for days and days talking about this, but alas, the podcast is running to an end and we need to save time for my favorite section, Learning from Leaders, where we find out a little bit of personal to go with this business conversation. Sound okay to you?
Absolutely.
All right, our first thing that we want to find out, what are you reading? What book is on your Kindle or bedside table?
Well, I've got two on my bedside table, and they're very much related. So one is the book called D-Day by Stephen Ambrose, who wrote Band of Brothers, which turned into the HBO series. And another book called The Generals, which is about Patton, MacArthur, and Marshall and how they went about helping lead to win World War II. So I'm fascinated by leadership. I'm fascinated by the power of leadership. And I think there's no better place to look at the role of leadership in terms of what the United States and its allies did during World War II. So that's why they're on my bedside table.
Yeah, talk about high stakes leadership right there. Leading
Absolutely.
When everything seems to be against you.
Yeah.
All right, our next question is your leadership superpower.
My leadership superpower, as I mentioned, I did the questionnaire that you have on your website, which I thought was great, by the way. So according to that, my leadership superpower is inspirational leadership. I actually like to think of myself, my leadership superpower is very much consistent what we've been talking about. It's the fact that I bring to bear a structured and disciplined approach to problem solving. Because for me as a leader, what I spend a lot of my time doing is solving problems. To the extent that I can bring a structured approach to doing that and also help the people on my team do that as well, as you just mentioned, I think helps me improve as a leader.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And as we went through kind of the framework that you talk about in the book, you concluded by saying after you come up with the solution, you've evaluated all the different options, you've settled upon a direction to go. The next step is to get your team on board, influence. And so I love this idea, inspiration, influence, bringing those along with you. And I think it's an absolute tremendous superpower. Our next question is a motivational quote, philosophy, or mantra, something that you live by.
Yeah. So it's a quote that I contribute to my late father, who was also a professor, English literature professor. And it's something that I can think back to my youngest days, him saying to me all the time, always reserve the right to get smarter. I never forget that. So in any situation, never leave the door closed. Always be willing to get feedback. Always be willing to invest in learning, because you always want to reserve the right to get smarter. So for me, that's one of the most powerful quotes that I can think about that informs my leadership to this day.
Yeah, and I think it goes along so well with what we've been talking about. I mean, Mr. Johnson could have used a little bit of that, keep the door open for further learning as he transitioned from Apple to Target and then ultimately to JCP.
Absolutely.
All right, our final question then is the book that you most often gift to friends, family, or colleagues, the book that you recommend.
Okay, so this is The Geek in Me, and The Geek in Me is very, very fond of Daniel Kahneman's book, Thinking Fast and Slow. So I think anybody, no matter what you do in life, we can learn about how as human beings we are flawed in terms of how we process information, make decisions, and solve problems. And Daniel's book is just a great eye-opener in terms of how we're often irrational and then what we can do to become more rational, what we can do to become better problem solvers and decision makers.
Yeah, and this ties right back into your quote that your father gave you, and that is, always be willing to learn more, different approaches. Sometimes you're going to need to think fast on your feet. Sometimes you're going to need to slow it down, be more analytical and solution conscious. I love this concept, this idea, this book recommendation. Corey, it's been a great journey so far on this podcast. Before we let you go, we'd love to find out how we can get in touch with you and, of course, pick up a copy of your book.
So getting in touch with me, you can find me on Twitter, you can find me on LinkedIn, you can find me on Facebook. Just search for Corey Phelps, McGill University. My email address, corey.phelps@mcgill.ca. You can find the book on all major online retailers, so Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, and so on.
Well, perfect. And we're going to link all of that up on the show notes so they can go to one place, click on that, and get right over to you. And I highly recommend that you go and pick up a copy and dive into this. Problem solving, as we talked about throughout this entire episode, is something that it's a gap right now that leaders are experiencing. And if you want to get ahead, if you want to have opportunities, if you want to have job security, figure out how to be a problem solver, and you will be in high demand. Corey, thank you for being this week's guest expert. It's been such a great journey with you.
Thank you, Jake. Thanks for the opportunity to speak.
All right, my friends and fellow elite achievers, so good to have Corey on the podcast. And, we had quite a bit of opportunity before we hit record to just sit back and talk about what it's like to live in San Diego, and what it's like to live in Montreal, and what it's like to live in Paris, and some of the experiences that we've shared, kind of crossing paths in different ways. I love this concept of problem solving. I didn't mention it during the podcast, but when I went to law school, I got the Creative Problem Solving Scholarship. Now, I'm sure they just gave it to everybody. It was just a way to get me to go to the school. But it really meant a lot to me because I always looked at myself as desiring to have that skill of problem solving and creative problem solving. Hey, that's like the holy grail of problem solving. And so as you look towards leadership and as you develop your leadership talents, focus in on being a problem solver. And I highly recommend picking up Corey's book. Of course, everything that we talked about on this episode can be found at jakeacarlson.com/ML133, episode 133. And until next week, I want to wish you the very best of days, an even better life. And remember, everything is figure-outable. Thanks for listening to the Modern Leadership Podcast. You can find me on Facebook at Speaker Jake, on Twitter at Jake A. Carlson, and of course the website, jakeacarlson.com. See you there.